Where was Abraham Lincoln born? Well, the history books we all read in school tell us Kentucky. A lot of people, including some historians, though, question whether that is true.
In the autumn of 2015, a small group of genealogists released the results of a mitochondrial DNA study that had taken more than a decade to complete. Their goal was modest on paper: settle a genealogical argument about the parentage of Nancy Hanks, the mother of Abraham Lincoln. What they actually did was confirm a confession Lincoln swore his best friend to secrecy over, expose a hidden genetic thread running through his family that stretched back tens of thousands of years, and hold up a mirror to a period of American history when the circumstances of a person's birth could ruin them for life. This is the story of that DNA, the secret it confirmed, and the century of shame that made the secret necessary in the first place. To understand why any of this mattered, you have to understand what illegitimacy actually meant in early America. It wasn't a private embarrassment. It was a legal category with teeth. Under the common law doctrine inherited from England, a child born outside marriage was labeled filius nullius, the child of no one. That wasn't a metaphor. Legally, an illegitimate child had no father in the eyes of the law. He or she could not inherit from him, bear his name, or make any claim on his estate. The child existed as an extension of the mother alone, which is why, in this era, illegitimate children were almost always given their mother's surname rather than the biological father's. The mother, meanwhile, bore the legal and social weight of the offense. In colonial and early Republic Virginia and Kentucky, unmarried pregnancy could trigger a formal charge of fornication, prosecuted through the county court system. Punishments varied by colony and era but included fines, public whipping, and terms in a house of correction. Historians of colonial law, including those who have studied Virginia's county court records extensively, have documented that these prosecutions were not rare curiosities. They were a routine mechanism through which communities policed female sexuality and reinforced the economic logic of legitimate inheritance. The social consequences outlasted the legal ones by generations. Families quietly folded illegitimate children into the household as nieces, nephews, or wards rather than acknowledge the truth. Church congregations sometimes required public confession from unwed mothers before allowing them back into full fellowship. A woman's entire reputation, and by extension her family's standing in a small rural community, could hinge on whether the timeline between a wedding and a birth looked respectable enough not to invite gossip. In an era when a man's political career could be destroyed by a whispered accusation about his birth or his mother's virtue, illegitimacy in a family tree was not just a private sorrow. It was ammunition, and everyone in public life understood that. This wasn't unique to Virginia or Kentucky. Similar fornication and bastardy statutes existed across the colonies, and later, the early states, often justified less by religious morality than by economics. A child born outside marriage had no legally responsible father, which meant the local parish or county could become financially responsible for that child's upkeep if the mother couldn't provide for herself. Prosecuting the mother, and sometimes naming the alleged father in court to force him to pay support, was as much about protecting town coffers as it was about policing virtue. That dual motive, moral judgment layered over financial self-interest, is part of why these laws persisted in various forms well into the 19th century, even as enforcement grew, less consistent over time. Abraham Lincoln knew this better than almost anyone. Sometime around 1850, while riding a circuit court route through Menard County, Illinois, with his law partner William Henry Herndon, Lincoln reportedly opened up about a subject he almost never discussed: his mother's origins. According to Herndon's later recollections, collected and published after Lincoln's death, Lincoln told him that his mother had been born illegitimate, the daughter of what Lincoln believed was a well-bred Virginia man whose identity he did not know. Lincoln asked Herndon to keep the story quiet for as long as he, Lincoln, was alive. Herndon kept that promise for decades. He didn't publish anything until 1889, 24 years after Lincoln's assassination, in his biography Herndon's Lincoln, The True Story of a Great Life, co-written with Jesse Week. By then, Herndon had spent years gathering first-hand testimony from people who had actually known Lincoln's family in Kentucky and Indiana, his stepmother, his cousin Dennis Hanks, and neighbors who remember Nancy Hanks Lincoln directly. Herndon's approach to biography was unusual for its time. He refused to sand Lincoln down into an untouchable icon, and he believed the public deserved the unvarnished record, uncomfortable details included. The backlash was immediate and lasting. Members of the Lincoln family, including Lincoln's surviving son Robert Todd Lincoln, were furious and spent years trying to manage how his father would be remembered, favoring a more polished, statesmanlike portrait over Herndon's warts-and-all account. Herndon was accused of exaggeration, bitterness, even fabrication, and some critics suggested his own strained finances and complicated feelings toward Lincoln's memory colored his reporting. For the next century, professional historians split into two camps over a single question. Was Nancy Hanks actually illegitimate, or had Herndon gotten it wrong? It's worth noting that Herndon wasn't working from thin air. His account rested on interviews he personally conducted with people who had known the Lincoln and Hanks families directly on the Kentucky and Indiana frontier. Dennis Hanks, who grew up alongside Nancy's children; John Hanks, a cousin who worked with young Abraham; and Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln, Thomas Lincoln's second wife and Abraham's stepmother, who had known Nancy personally before her death. These were not second-hand rumors picked up decades later. They were first-hand recollections from people inside the family circle, filtered, of course, through the limits of human memory and the passage of many years. The argument wasn't only based on Lincoln's private remark to his law partner. There was documentary evidence sitting in Kentucky County archives that lent Herndon's account real weight. Court records from Mercer County, Kentucky, show that in November 1789, a woman named Lucy Hanks was indicted by a grand jury for fornication. In this period and place, such a charge functioned as a legal acknowledgment that an unmarried woman had given birth. The child's existence essentially served as the evidence for the crime. Convicted women face potential fines, public punishment, or confinement. The timing lines up with the accepted birth years of Lucy's daughters. Nancy, born around 1784, and her younger sister Sarah, born around 1787, both years before any confirmed marriage for Lucy. 5 months after the 1789 indictment, Lucy Hanks signed a document giving her consent to marry a man named Henry Sparrow, writing in her own hand that she was of age and freely approved the match. She and Sparrow married on April 30th, 1790, and shortly afterward, the fornication charge against her was dropped, marriage having restored, in the eyes of the court and community, the respectability the pregnancy had cost her. Nancy, however, kept the Hanks name for the rest of her life, not Sparrow's, consistent with the common law practice of naming illegitimate children after their mother rather than a father who, legally, did not exist. No baptismal record identifies her father. No marriage record for Lucy predates Nancy's birth. The paper trail simply goes cold at the one point that would have mattered most. For decades, this was as close as historians could get to proof. Biographer William E. Barton, writing in the early 20th century, concluded Herndon had been right. Other researchers, most notably Kentucky genealogist Lewis A. Warren, argued the opposite, that Lucy Hanks had actually been born Lucy Shipley, previously married to a since-deceased man named James Hanks, making Nancy fully legitimate. Warren was confident enough to dismiss the illegitimacy account outright, describing it in 1941 as one more Herndon-era myth that deserved to be retired. Neither side could close the case. The frontier left behind too few records, and the ones that survive were open to competing interpretations. Solving it would require evidence that simply didn't exist in the 19th or even most of the 20th century, a way to read the biological record directly. In 2002, genealogist Suzanne Hallstrom launched what would become known as the Hanks DNA Project, later joined by fellow researchers Nancy C. Royce, Stephen A. Whitlock, Richard G. Heilman, and Gerald M. Haslam, several of whom had already devoted decades of independent research to Nancy Hanks Lincoln's ancestry. Their tool of choice was mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, genetic material passed down almost unchanged from mother to child, generation after generation, along the direct female line. Unlike the DNA in a cell's nucleus, mtDNA doesn't recombine with a father's genetic material, which means a living woman today can carry an mtDNA sequence nearly identical to that of a female ancestor who lived centuries earlier. This mattered enormously for one practical reason. Abraham Lincoln has no living direct descendants. His last confirmed descendant, great-grandson Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith, died in 1985 without children, ending the line. But mtDNA analysis doesn't require a direct descendant of Lincoln himself. It only requires descendants, through an unbroken female line, of any woman who shared his mother's maternal ancestry, including sisters, aunts, and cousins of Nancy Hanks. The research team spent years locating and verifying such descendants across multiple branches of the extended Hanks family. They identified two groups to compare against each other. The first consisted of matrilineal descendants tracing back to and Lee Hanks, the woman most researchers, including Herndon and Barton, identified as Lucy Hanks's mother and Nancy's grandmother. The second consisted of descendants of the Shipley sisters, Rachel and Naomi, who Lewis Warren's theory claimed were Lucy's actual biological sisters. If Warren was right, both groups should share matching mtDNA. If Herndon was right, they should not. Samples were processed by Gene, a genetic testing laboratory in Houston, Texas, operating through Family Tree DNA's testing infrastructure. The findings were released on October 21, 2015, deliberately timed to mark the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's assassination, and published in For the People, the newsletter of the Abraham Lincoln Association, rather than in a peer-reviewed academic journal. That distinction matters for anyone evaluating the strength of a claim. The study's methodology and conclusions have circulated for a decade largely unchallenged among genealogists and Lincoln historians, but it has not gone through formal academic peer review, and researchers involved have acknowledged that the descendant samples are the closest available proxies rather than Lincoln's own DNA, since no biological material from Lincoln, his mother, or his son Robert Todd Lincoln was directly tested. With that caveat noted, the results were unambiguous. Every descendant tracing back to and Lee Hanks carried an identical, and notably rare, mitochondrial haplogroup. The Shipley line descendants carried a completely different and far more common haplogroup, indicating no shared maternal ancestor within a genealogically meaningful time frame. The two family lines simply did not connect the way Warren's theory required. The conclusion put an end to more than 100 years of argument. Lucy Hanks was indeed the daughter of Lee and Joseph Hanks, exactly as Herndon and Barton had argued, and the Shipley sister theory that had been used for decades to argue Nancy Hanks was legitimately born did not hold up under genetic scrutiny. Nancy Hanks Lincoln really was, as her son quietly confessed in that buggy conversation, born outside of marriage. But buried in that confirmation was something the researchers hadn't set out to find. The haplogroup shared by every verified descendant in the Lee Hanks line was designated X1C, and X1C is extraordinarily uncommon among families with colonial Anglo-American ancestry. Here's why that detail is significant. Every human maternal line traces back to a common ancestral population in Africa roughly 150,000 years ago. As populations spread and diverged over tens of thousands of years, mutations accumulated and created the distinct mitochondrial haplogroups used in genetic genealogy today. Most Americans of British, Irish, or German colonial descent carry haplogroups such as H, J, T, U, or K. Haplogroup H alone accounts for roughly 40 to 45% of all European mitochondrial lineages. Haplogroup X, by contrast, is rare across the board, and it's split into two major branches roughly 20,000 to 25,000 years ago. The X2 branch spread through parts of Europe, and notably, into some indigenous American populations, though it remains uncommon even there. The X1 branch took an almost entirely different route, concentrating instead in North Africa, the Horn of Africa, and the Near East, regions including Egypt, Ethiopia, and the Levant. It essentially never gained a foothold in Britain, Ireland, or the parts of Northern Europe that supplied the bulk of colonial Anglo-American settlers. Population genetics research on the Near East has found the highest concentrations of haplogroup X in the world among the Druze communities of Lebanon, Syria, and Israel, an ethno-religious group with a strong tradition of marrying within their community, which has helped preserve unusually old genetic lineages largely undiluted over centuries. X1C, the specific subclade found in the Hanks descendants, is one of the rarer branches within that already uncommon lineage. None of this points to anything recent. It says nothing about the identity of Nancy Hanks's unknown father, and it isn't evidence of a hidden relationship somewhere in 18th century Virginia. What it means is something slower and stranger. At some point deep in prehistory, long before anyone in the Hanks family ever set foot in colonial America, a maternal line carrying this rare marker made its way, generation by generation, into the population that eventually became the English and Scots-Irish settlers of the American backcountry. Geneticists studying population movement generally describe haplogroup distributions as layered evidence of migration, not proof of any single event. A rare Near Eastern associated marker turning up in a British Isles descended family doesn't mean a Near Eastern ancestor lived recently. It more likely reflects population movements stretching back thousands of years, including the spread of early farming populations out of the Near East into Europe during the Neolithic period, along with later waves of trade, conquest, and migration that quietly redistributed genetic markers across enormous distances and timescales. A single rare haplogroup can persist, essentially hidden, through dozens of generations before it happens to surface in a documented family line being studied for an unrelated reason. In this case, a genealogical controversy about Abraham Lincoln's grandmother. It's a reminder that the idea of a pure English or Scots-Irish colonial bloodline was never as clean as the mythology suggested. Human populations have been mixing, migrating, and intermarrying for tens of thousands of years, and the genetic record of any family, traced back far enough, tends to reveal exactly that kind of complexity. The Hanks case is a particularly vivid illustration simply because it happened to involve one of the most scrutinized families in American history, and because the marker in question was rare enough to be striking rather than easily dismissed as statistical noise. It's worth pausing on who Nancy Hanks actually was, because in most retellings of Lincoln's life, she is reduced to a footnote, the frontier mother who died young. She was born around 1784 in what was then Hampshire County, Virginia, today Mineral County, West Virginia. In 2008, the Mineral County Historical Society formally recognized a research site there as her birthplace. And in 2009, the West Virginia House of Delegates passed a resolution honoring her during the bicentennial of her son's birth. Record-keeping on the Virginia and Kentucky frontier was thin and inconsistent. This was not Boston nor Philadelphia, with organized parishes and careful documentation, but scattered, mobile frontier communities where an official birth or marriage record was often an afterthought. Nancy was raised from infancy by her grandparents, Joseph and Lee Hanks. When Joseph died around 1793, 9-year-old Nancy went to live with her Aunt Elizabeth Hanks and Elizabeth's husband Thomas Sparrow, and was known during childhood as Nancy Sparrow, an arrangement that only muddied the historical record further. She wasn't the only child in that household carrying the weight of illegitimacy. Elizabeth and Thomas also raised Dennis Hanks, born in 1799 to Nancy's own aunt, under similar circumstances. It was evidently not an isolated family pattern, but a recurring one. Despite all of it, those who knew her described Nancy as intelligent, devout, and capable, a woman who could read at a time when literacy, especially for frontier women, was far from guaranteed, and who reportedly did needlework and domestic labor for neighboring families to help support her household. Contemporary accounts describe her as tall, slender, and dark-haired, with a reflective, somewhat melancholy temperament that several who knew her contrasted with her husband Thomas's more easygoing nature. In 1806, she married Thomas Lincoln, and the couple had 3 children, Sarah, Abraham, and Thomas Jr., who died in infancy. In 1818, at the family's homestead in southern Indiana, an outbreak of what was then called milk sickness, later understood to be caused by drinking milk from cattle that had grazed on white snakeroot, swept through the small community. Nancy's aunt and uncle, Elizabeth and Thomas Sparrow, died first. Nancy fell ill soon after and died at 34 when Abraham was 9 years old. He and his father built her coffin themselves and buried her on a hillside near their farm. Years later, according to Herndon, Lincoln said of her, "All that I am or hope to be, I owe to my angel mother." Whatever the literal biological truth of that statement, Lincoln clearly believed it, and he chose to see his origins not as something to hide, but as the root of whatever was best in him, even while understanding exactly how dangerous the full truth could be if it ever became public in his lifetime. Strip away the genetic terminology, and the real story here isn't really about DNA at all. It's about how a legal and social system built around legitimacy shaped the lives of women like Lucy Hanks and children like Nancy Hanks, and how one of those children's sons went on to become the most consequential president in American history, while quietly carrying a secret that could have been turned into a political weapon against him. Lincoln rose from an Indiana log cabin with, by his own estimate, less than 2 years of total formal schooling, in a family that owned no slaves and little land, moving repeatedly in search of better prospects. He went on to hold the Union together through the Civil War, sign the Emancipation Proclamation, and deliver the Gettysburg Address, all while a document in a Kentucky courthouse recorded that his grandmother had once been formally charged with the crime of bringing his mother into the world outside of marriage. If his political opponents had ever gotten hold of the full story and understood how to use it, it's easy to imagine how it might have been weaponized against a man whose fitness for office and personal character were already under relentless attack throughout his career. The 2015 mtDNA study didn't uncover anything scandalous in the biological sense. What it did was quietly confirm, through hard scientific evidence, a private truth that Lincoln had asked his closest friend to guard until after his death, and along the way, it revealed a much older genetic story that undercuts any tidy myth about pure colonial ancestry. Both threads point to the same underlying lesson. The categories society uses to judge people, legitimate or illegitimate, pure, bloodline, or mixed, tend to collapse the moment you look closely enough, whether that's a genealogist digging through 18th century court records or a geneticist reading a strand of mitochondrial DNA under a microscope. Lucy Hanks was prosecuted for becoming pregnant outside marriage. Her daughter Nancy grew up carrying that stigma, legally invisible to any father, raised by relatives rather than her mother, in a system that offered illegitimate children essentially no protections. And yet, from that same lineage came a man whose words and decisions still shape how Americans understand their own country a century and a half later. The identity of Nancy Hanks's biological father, the well-bred Virginia man Lincoln vaguely referenced to Herndon, remains unknown, and in all likelihood always will. The paper trail that might have named him was never created, or didn't survive. But what does survive is enough. A court record from Mercer County, a private confession preserved by one loyal friend for nearly 4 decades, and finally, a piece of genetic evidence that took modern science to read. Together, they confirm a truth Lincoln carried quietly his entire adult life, and they leave behind a reminder of how much power a system of shame once held over ordinary people, and how thoroughly one extraordinary life managed to outgrow it. There's a natural temptation when a story like this surfaces to reach for tidy lessons, that greatness can come from anywhere, that shame doesn't have to be destiny, that the secrets a society insists on keeping often turn out to be far less scandalous than the fears surrounding them. Those lessons aren't wrong, exactly, but they can also flatten what actually happened to real people. Lucy Hanks was a teenager or young woman who became pregnant, was formally charged with a crime for it, and spent the rest of her recorded life carrying that history, even after marriage restored her legal standing. Nancy Hanks grew up understanding, in a very concrete legal sense, that she had no father recognized by the state she lived in. Neither woman left behind a diary or a letter explaining how that felt. What they left behind instead is a scattered paper trail, a family secret whispered to one trusted friend, and 2 centuries later, a strand of mitochondrial DNA that quietly settled an argument they never knew was happening. That may be the most honest way to close the story, not with a moral, but with an acknowledgement of how much of the past is unrecoverable, and how rare it is that science and history line up cleanly enough to answer a question at all. In this case, they did. Lincoln's private words to Herndon in a horse-drawn buggy somewhere in central Illinois turned out to be exactly